You all live in Boston. Well, many of you do. You've been to a million venues where there are talks, and then there's 2 minutes for conversation at the end or questions. And we are bucking that trend. We actually have about an hour to talk together. I'm going to ask that when you ask your questions, and they don't necessarily have to be for a specific panelist, that you please introduce yourselves, because we are a community of discourse. Should I pass the mic to people who are asking questions, or should I just ask them to yell?
I think you just...
Brian says yell, I say yell. Okay? So from here, right? Ed's looking at me. He'll instruct you. Ed will show you how it's done from your diaphragms. Anna will show you how it's done. When you have questions, I'll point, but please just yell from here, and we have quite a bit of time to talk. And thank you again to the wonderful panelists.
My name is Patricia Hanna, and I'm Vice Chair Emerita of Northeastern's board. I want to welcome this and thank this panel for being here. I don't have a question as much as I have a comment. And it says, Anne DeVere Smith spoke, and she spoke about communication in lyrical terms. I sat here and thought, we have a populist movement in this country that does nothing but yell. There is no softness, there is no room for all of the elements of speech and communication that you spoke of. And that's what you brought right to the fore of my mind.
Comments, thoughts, responses? You don't need to respond to each comment, but anybody's free to if you have something.
Well, I just want to say that I think one of the most serious places that we see that yelling is in political disagreement. And it's very, very bad right now. And the fact that the media, the fact that the media is so reluctant to use its sensitivity, its intelligence, to help us make a meeting place where we can really talk and exchange ideas without having to be in black and white lines is a very serious situation right now, and I think lives are at stake.
Yes.
Loud. First of all, I thank the panelists. It's been a real treat to hear you. I just returned from the...
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry.
We all know you.
My name is Margaret Burnham, and I teach at the Northeastern University School of Law. So I just returned from the reunion of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which celebrated its 50th anniversary in North Carolina this past weekend. And I actually happened to be a participant in the SNCC movement. I was a young woman at the time, and so it was my reunion as well. And I guess my question is this. Blanche really sort of gave us the reason for looking at biography, but then she moved into the current period, and she talked about the challenges that face us today. And that is what every single speaker, major speaker at this event did. Now here's the issue. All of those speakers were male, because back then, those were the people who made that history. They were Bob Moses, Harry Belafonte, John Lewis, who spoke absolutely brilliantly. Every single one of them spoke brilliantly. And they spoke both about the past and about the current challenges facing us as a people and as a country. And so there's a way in which capturing a moment in history, as important as it may be, can also have an exclusionary consequences. And I'd love to have Blanche and others address that question.
Should I use the mic or just yell? Thank you,
use
Margaret.
and
How
yell.
wonderful that you were there. Now, aren't you also in the book, The Women of SNCC?
I am.
Yes, I just blurred it. It's wonderful.
That's a small corrective, Blanche. A very small corrective.
No, it's a small corrective, but finally, after 50 years, the women of SNCC are being recognized. And that's really, you know, the question of lives. All of the women, all of the biographies until the women's movement were of straight white men. And the idea that you could write a biography out of that loop was unacceptable. And that's really important. And the question of race is still, I mean, it's still absolutely the epicenter of our reality. I mean, we have 2.4 million people in prison, 80% of whom are folks of color and struggle, and 80% of whom have done no violent crime, and they're there for, you know, this war against drugs, which is an absolutely made-up idea. Well, what is going on here? What is really going on here is neo-slavery, because that's where the industries are. And we have a prison industrial complex that's totally disgusting. And nobody's talking about it. The politicians aren't talking about it, very few. I mean, Angela Davis is writing about it. And other folks like that. But very few people. At John Jay, we have a project where we are talking about it. But it's a very tiny little thing in the world. So how does this happen? And how does it happen that we fought World War II with a totally segregated military? And how did it happen that, you know, blood plasma was segregated, black and white, Christian and Hebrew, until you want to guess? 1958. Eisenhower in 1958, and it was, I hated that Truman gets credit for desegregating the military. He didn't do it. Eisenhower did it. Eisenhower went around and fired any colonel who wouldn't integrate the base. Eisenhower in 58, and what Republican wants credit for that now? So the Democrats don't give the Republicans credit, and the Republicans don't want it. I mean, where's the Woodrow Wilkie of the Republican Party? Anyway, bottom line, the head of the Red Cross at the time was General Al Grunther, and he wrote to Ike, "You can't do this, the South doesn't want any integrated blood." And Eisenhower said, "Well, then the South won't get any blood." Done. But the bottom line is, what happened? And what happened to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? There's a good book, Eyes Off the Prize, which really gives a case-by-case reality. I mean, the Dixiecrats dominated the Democratic Party, and John Foster Dulles certainly didn't want anything binding, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is ignored. It's not ratified until George Herbert Walker Bush, at the end of the Cold War in 1992, says, well, at the end of the Cold War, let's stand for at least civil and political rights, and it's done, with a lot of exceptions and so on, but the economic and social rights, which reinforce racism everywhere, has not even gotten a discussion yet, but we're getting it. I don't know if that goes.
Other questions, comments? Yeah.
This is loud. Okay.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Emily Spieler. I'm the Dean of the Law School at Northeastern. And just with regard to NESRI, the chair of the board of NESRI is a member of the faculty of the law school at Northeastern. So, Martha Davis.
Oh, great.
So it seems to me every story needs a listener. It's a kind of Howard Forster problem, right? It's a, can you hear something when it falls in the forest? And that the telling of a story is good for the teller, but may not accomplish what the narrator wants unless there's the intended audience. And in a way, for a lawyer or a doctor, that's easier, because I used to be a lawyer. What I did mostly was individual cases for workers, and many of them were looking for someone who could really ratify their story. They wanted their story heard in a neutral venue for ratification, but actually just ratification in a conversation was a step forward. And I think that's true for doctors too, that one of the infuriating things I think about doctors now, or the complaints about doctors, is that they don't listen enough, and that they send you off for a series of diagnostic tests without having heard the story. But I'm curious about the rest of you, the sort of issue of how you find the audience you seek, and whether and how you know that you've been effectively heard.
Loud. Yes, I'm loud. One thing that I found with this catalog that I was very happy about, I had 2 essays written by different friends. One friend is basically incredibly gloomy. The world looks very dark to her. Nothing is as it should be. The other friend is buoyant, upbeat, energetic. The friend who's gloomy thought it was a wonderful story of a happy family. The one who was upbeat thought it was dark. You could see in those colors the pathology, the relationships. So I was happy that they, I mean, I was surprised. But I was happy that my audience could come to his or her own conclusions, and I think that's what we all want.
I think that patients need not just to tell their story, but I think it's very important that the doctor do his part to give that story back to the patient. That is how that suffering can be recognized and possibly healed. I mean, doctors who do this are swimming the wrong way up a river that's tumbling in the wrong direction really fast. You know, we work in a system, we have a healthcare system that doesn't value patient time, doctor time, doesn't value thinking. You know, I tell the story that I was recently at my practice and I saw 10 patients in a morning. The first 9 were my usual hypertensive, diabetic, hypercholesterolemic, asthma COPDers. And the last one was a perfectly healthy guy who had an ingrown toenail. I cut out that guy's ingrown toenail in the same amount of time. I took care of all my other patients. But for that act, I got paid more than I got paid for all other 9 added together. That's the incentive system that we work in. That is what is driving healthcare costs. That is what is robbing patients of the ability to tell and have their story heard. And that is what is robbing doctors of the reason they went into medicine in the first place, which is to take care of patients. I don't know, I hope this is the first, I wore a button, I took it off my coat today because I thought it wasn't appropriate. It says, I'm a doctor and I'm for healthcare reform. I am. I hope it gets us where we need to go. But I don't know, I don't think that the stories that I tell get us any closer, except maybe to remind people that there has to be a story. And that story is an important tool and an important part of healing.
Well, I certainly believe in the power of the story that wants to be told, which is sometimes different than the story that's being told. And what interests me is the desire that a person has to express. So when I first started learning how to listen, can everyone hear me in the back?
Yes.
When I first started learning how to listen, I was a poor actress, never working, and reading, as I mentioned before, reading complaint letters at KLM Airlines. And that's what I got from being such a snob as a junior professor at Carnegie Mellon University and deciding after 1 year I would rather walk dogs, which is what I actually did, and worked at KLM Airlines. And so I was at a cocktail party where I was nobody, and I didn't like to tell people I was an actress because they would say, well, what do I know you from? What have you been in? And I never was in anything. This one particular time, my date was off talking, and I was standing next to a woman whose husband was off talking, and it turned out that she was a linguist. And I told her that I would like to get people to talk to me in a way that they would make mistakes, because I knew when there were mistakes that this gap was full of the story they wanted to tell, that it was full of desire. Or I think it may be related to something that you spoke about, Lisa, that I find so intriguing. The uncertainty is the ocean we swim in. So I would like that uncertain moment to come. And she said, well, I'll give you 3 questions, this linguist said, I'll give you 3 questions that will guarantee that people's language will fall apart. And I knew instinctively that that's where acting could begin, and possibly action. And those 3 questions were, have you ever come close to death? Have you ever been accused of something that you did not do? And do you know the circumstances of your birth? So I think about being an audience with a story, not necessarily the story that's being told, but the story that wants to be told. And I hope that when people see me on stage or see me in any other media, that what they feel from me is my desire and my effort to speak louder than they hear what I'm saying. Because I do think that that's the place where we can swim in uncertainty and do even social healing.
I just want to add something to this. I'm going to switch hats. I have a past life as a poet. And I came, can you hear me in the back? As a poet through the women's movement. And there was a period in the women's movement, in women's poetry, when voice was at the center of everything we did. And the argument was to give voice to the voiceless. And all of the poets I respected and learned from, Adrienne Rich especially, but Paula Gunn-Allen and Olga Brumas, everybody was trying to give voice to those who didn't have one. And then we went through a very difficult political moment when we realized that you can't just do that. You can't just speak for others. You can't just assume you know what their story would be. You have to listen to them. And the feminist movement, particularly women's literature, pulled back completely from that imperative. That imperative became an embarrassment. That imperative became a sign of the sort of over-appropriative white women's movement that was trying not to listen, but to take over people's voices. And people stopped. And people stopped so completely that you ended up with scenarios where voiceless people just stayed voiceless. I remember an incident where there was a 15-year-old developmentally disabled young woman raped by her stepfather, impregnated by him, wanted an abortion. It went all the way through the state. It got to then Governor Huckabee. He said no, and nobody spoke for her. We were so busy saying we can't speak for others, we have to listen to them, that the whole question of how do you listen to people who don't yet have a voice got shelved. And then, and I'm sorry to do this, I don't mean to flatter my panelists, but then people like Anna Deavere Smith came back and said, no, we have a responsibility to give voice to others and to imagine what they would say if they can't have the stage. And I really take hope from the work of people like Anna Deavere Smith, who brought that imperative back and who said, listening means imagining what voiceless people would say. And so part of the hope I take about the power life story may have in the next moment is a return not to the naivete of that movement, it was criticized rightly, but to a new sense of, Margaret, to go back to your question, how we might be audience for one another in a way that is not appropriative, that is not stealing, that is not taking over. And the panelists are here because each one of them has given me hope that we can learn to do that in a not naive way. So I just want to thank them again for that, and that's my response to your question.
Can I ask a quick question about that? So is anybody here under 30 in this room today? Oh, there you go. Yes! Yes. Because the thing, you know, one of my students at NYU came up to me, wanted to get some tips on interviewing because he was going down to New Orleans to interview this guy called Sissy Nobi, who's a bounce rapper. You know, he went to this thing on bounce rap. So, of course, I felt like there was nothing I could possibly say because I didn't even know what bounce rap was. And if you go online, I mean, in YouTube, you can find Sissy Nobi and you can find out all about bounce rap. And so I wonder what's going on given the fact that people who are under 30 have lots of ways of speaking. And it's so many venues. And people who run media companies as far back as 6 or 8 or 10 years ago were terrified about that. Viacom wasn't going to be able to control all of the content anymore. And so, and that's the sort of crisis that publishing and newspapers and everybody else is in, is that a whole lot of people are speaking and nobody can really capture it. So I don't know what we do about that.
I think, I don't want to omit people behind me. Amilcar?
I'm Amilcar Barreto, Associate Director.
Louder.
Associate Director of the Humanities Center.
And political scientist.
And political scientist. My question to all the panelists is, in each one of your art forms, how do you deal with the complexity of truly representing the individual, or do you simply assign yourself the task of only selecting one portion? For example, I think of a historic figure like a Thomas Jefferson, someone who certain people glorify the writer of the Declaration of Independence. Some people go back and, for example, look at his notes on Virginia, who said incredibly good derogatory things about people of color. Do you focus on one? Do you focus on the other? Half and half, some equation. Because in each one of your forms, you're always dealing with the complexity of how to represent an entire life history of a person in one medium, whether it's a painting, it's a story, or a performance. So I'd like each panelist, if you could, to address that issue.
I could just pass the mic to my
Right here. Because you're in television too.
Yeah.
I'm not in television. I'm not in television. If my stories live on,
provoke television.
if my stories live on, yes, in house, yes.
It's complicated.
But you know, he's a very complicated character. I'm not going there. He's Sherlock Holmes. You know, Sherlock Holmes, just as an aside, would have been a doctor if we had had any ability to make a diagnosis, or if we had had any therapies to give people. He would have been a doctor. He should have been a doctor. But we didn't, so he just solved murders. Now House can give expression to Sherlock Holmes' inner doctor. But, you know, when I look at my patients, or my stories about these patients, I can't tell their whole stories. You know why? Because their identity is a secret, not for me, but I can't tell people who this is. So in some ways, I have a very easy job of focusing, choosing what I focus on, because I have to be careful about revealing their identities. But that's really a bogus answer. You know, a storyteller's job and a doctor's job is to capture the individual in details, because it's details that are going to lead you where you need to go in terms of medicine. It's the odd detail that they maybe haven't mentioned before because it seems so weird. When I move my eyes, I can hear it in my ears. That's a real symptom. It's a real syndrome. You know, so it's those details that are so specific, so delicious, so perfect, that really capture so much of who that person is as an individual that they would describe it, but also who they are as a patient. And I long for and wait for and jump on those details, which both are and are not the whole person.
I don't think there's any way, I don't even know who I am as a whole person. To represent that would be impossible. A lot of my paintings are about people looking away, looking down, caught in the second, and they're inscrutable to me. When I look at these, that's what I'm trying to find out. Who were you in those photographs? What are you thinking? And I know it can't be done. The characters we love the most in literature are the richest, most complex people. And they can't, I don't think they can be pinned down like that, but it'd be great if they could.
Or it would be terrible if they
Oh, that's right.
That's such a wonderful question, actually. I immediately thought of what Joe Lash said about Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt is infinite. And the question then is, well, what do you focus on? And a lot of folks say to me always, you don't spend enough time on her children. And I don't. And I say, well, Eleanor Roosevelt's infinite, there'll be other people. And then I say things like, I spend about as much time on her children as she did. But then what do we pause and focus on? And there are a couple of stories that I spent a lot of time thinking about because I had a eureka moment when I read something she wrote very shortly before she died. The happiest day of my life, she wrote, was the day that she made the first team at field hockey in her school at Allenswood in England. And that was so important to me because I got it. Eleanor Roosevelt liked sweaty, knockabout sports. She liked contact sports. And most importantly, Eleanor Roosevelt was competitive. And once I got that, you know, it didn't surprise me that the first letter she wrote as First Lady to one of her best friends was, this year, I have made as much in my columns, through my columns, as Franklin has made as president. So,
That's wonderful.
like that.
Well, as an actress, you try to stay open to possibilities and choices, and you struggle, or I think we all struggle against being too definite, and it does come back to the details always. Chekhov was a doctor, one of the best playwrights in many, many years. You know, I played Thomas Jefferson in one of my plays, and I was okay with the notes on the state of Virginia. But I think I wasn't a good actress because I had trouble with him saying that Phyllis Wheatley was no poet. All of the things that he said, when he got to that, it was really rough. But the objective is to keep it open, to keep the windows open, and to keep all the possibilities alive, because it's up to the audience to make certain decisions about who someone is.
Leo, you just yell.
Okay. No, Leo Brody's spouse. I just think there's an interesting kind of thread going through here, and maybe I should say a positive word about deconstruction. Well, not academic deconstruction, but the way in which, when deconstruction came in, it's really about uncertainty, and it's about contradiction. And it's about being comfortable, in a way, with uncertainty and contradiction, and not to see uncertainty as incoherence, but to see it as another level of coherence. And I think everyone in their different ways are talking about that. That is, the different ways, the different contradictions in people's personalities, how to express that, how to express it medically, how to express it in performance, in painting, in biography, and how to express something of the kind of inescapability of not being able finally to understand human nature. I think that's part of what it appeals to audiences, because audiences then can fill in. And so you fill in with your own nature the gaps in the understanding of what people are like.
I just wanted to say something quickly about, well, first of all, now in my teaching even, on the first day, I say, and I don't know whether this is a relief to them or not, that confidence is overrated. And it's all about doubt, and it's all about tolerating doubt. One of the people I've got a chance to interview at NYU, where I now teach, is an economist who talks about decision-making in the face of a profound ignorance. That we just don't know right now in the world. And so then how do we behave? And I think about Jim Coddington at MoMA, who is a conservateur and just loves Picasso so much. And he said about Picasso to me, he said, if I could just paint like that for 15 minutes. And I said, well, what is it about Picasso that you, he said, because he was so, his confidence, he was never even making a mistake. He was changing his mind, right? I took this to Bryce Martin, who didn't have very charitable things to say about Picasso. And he roots for doubt. You know, he talks about the unease that you see in Jackson Pollock or in Gerhard Richter, and where that kind of unease, that uncertainty, that discomfort, that ocean that we swim in. And I even wonder for a physician if that's the place that the physician can partner with the person who is suffering, because after all, we are all mortal. You could get cancer too.
Well, I think that doctors and patients collaborate as experts, always. You know, the patient is an expert, the doctor is an expert on, you know, medicine and disease, but the patient is the expert on his illness and his disease. And I actually think it would be nice if doctors could partner with their patients in facing death. But I think that far too many of us are terrified of death and feel like if we know it all, it can't possibly happen to us. I wish that doctors embraced uncertainty. I think it's rare. I don't think, as human beings, we much care for uncertainty.
Actually, I was just saying to Leo the other day, I've been getting a lot of old paintings out lately, and they're distant from me now. They're like objects of themselves, and they look finished. And I think of every stroke I made, agonizing, is this right, is this right, this is a mess, I'm going to have to start all over, maybe I'll throw it out. And somehow I ramshackle it together, and then 3 years later I'd look at it and go, ooh, I wonder who did that. Always doubt the whole time you're working, which is very painful. No?
Loud and stand, please. And then I'm sorry, I'll come there right next. I apologize. Can we go ahead?
I'm Kumi Silva. I'm an assistant professor in communication studies and also associate director for the Humanities Center. I was wondering if, in some ways, recreating something from memory has a redemptive quality to it, and that allows and kind of nurtures that recreation, because you mentioned Gerhard Richter, and I thought about, very similar to your paintings, and he has the painting of his uncle Louis, yes, who is a Nazi, and it's a painting where he's dressed in uniform and he is Uncle Louis, and I wonder in the same way, and also because in Twilight, and I think even in biography and even in the medical stories from a doctor's perspective, is there some kind of redemptive quality to recreating this?
Did everyone hear that in the library, the question of if there's a redemptive quality to recreation? Who wants this first?
You know, certainly in medicine, everything looks so obvious once you know the answer. It's like any puzzle. Once you see the answer, you feel like, oh, I was an idiot. How could I not see it? And once you see it, you can never unsee it. So, knowing the answer, seeing it in retrospect, of course, changes your perspective. When I'm trying to write a story, sure, I talk to the doctor and the patient, but you know, I really trust the note that the doctor wrote when he was in the grips of uncertainty. That's where the truth lies. That's where, and the patient probably remembers it pretty clearly too, because of course, they lived it. But retrospect, seeing it in the past changes everything. And I don't know if that's just medicine.
In fact, Carla, if I may.
Of course.
In neurosciences now, going back to the redemption, you know, it used to be the case that if you get a patient to talk about something that is traumatic, that this will have a redemptive value. Right. Now there are studies showing that if you do that, you are deepening the scar also, and you do it by imaging techniques, obviously brain imaging, fMRIs. So it's not clear that what's happening. You must know, Lisa, more about that. Then, you know, that the studies now showing that focusing on traumas and, you know, psychological traumas and asking the patient to relive them, in fact, creates deeper connections, neuronic connections, if you want to speak in a simplistic term, that in fact are creating more of a scar than otherwise. And so it has profound implications because psychoanalysis was based on your question.
Well, but then I think about a project like, although it would have been recent memory, a project like the forgiveness campaign in Rwanda. So I went to Rwanda 10 years after the genocide and went to the Gacaca trials and talked to many Tutsis and went to prison and talked to Hutus. And what the president is asking the public to do is to sit as the murderer comes forward and tells the story. And to access all of this. It's interesting because when I performed here in the ART 2 years ago, my play Let Me Down Easy, and the play no longer has the Rwandan material, but I played it there at Harvard because of their interest in human rights. And I performed this one young woman who's considered a star young leader, now at Stanford in pre-med actually, who was 6 at the time of the genocide. And she seemed to have it completely together. And her rhythms, how she talked, was quite like a kind of Stanford student. And, you know, then I lost my sister, and then I found my sister, and then we were in a place where they were shoving people into a killing. They would cut your head, and they would shove you into a hole. And just when they rished my sister, they said, you know what, you kids, we're tired. You go home. We want to go and eat. You're going to be killed. You're going to be killed. You're going to be killed by sorrow. Right? So I did this, and there were Rwandans who came to this. As you know, there's a population here in Boston. Came to this, and afterwards, someone came up to me and said, I know her, and I knew her when she was a girl in boarding school, and I'm worried about her because of the way she's repeating things. What are they doing at Stanford to take care of her? Well, talk about listening. I was shocked that these audience members listened that carefully, not to what she said well, but to what she didn't say well. And yet, she's being asked to go around with different groups to activate young people and to activate teens to make a difference in their societies. And so we call upon people to revisit these histories. And back to something you said, Margaret Burnham, I mean, and even in either traumatic histories or unfinished histories or inadequate histories. So I don't know what we do about trying to revise the story without visiting the painful parts of the story. I think that's one project that going back to look at the story of the trauma is really about. It's about a reconstruction of it. I'm probably not using that word correctly, but.
That's such an important question. And it really raises so many issues. It raises a lot of issues about living in the moment and mental health. And what is mental health? We just attended a memorial for Lou Ormond, who was one of the founders of the modern analytic therapy. And he always said, you know, mental health is living in the moment. And when folks who were talking about Lou Ormond at this memorial went on and on about, you know, if you live in the past, you're being caught up in a self-reference swamp. Get out of it. I was thinking, oh, that's really interesting, because Eleanor Roosevelt lived a life of forgiveness by living in the moment. I mean, she didn't go back and back and back and criticize folks for all the hurt they dumped on her. And a lot of people have said, well, you know, she never got psychoanalyzed. I tried to get her to be, I tried to get her to a therapist. I've had 5 different people write me letters about it. They tried to get her to a therapist, and she refused always, including therapists who said I tried to help her, but she wouldn't let me. But she went on. And she always lived in the moment, facing every crisis as it came up, and facing it with a great deal of, you know, facing it with her heart. She unpacked her heart with incredible generosity. So there is that, and it's maybe not redemption, but it maybe is survival. As in, survival is the best revenge.
We had a question from the library. Don't ignore the library.
Hi, Maria from the library.
No, literally. She's really from the library. Really loud, Maria.
So I loved when President Alboon and Blanche were talking about spirituality and bringing that dialogue into the humanities once again. And Blanche, when you were talking about Eleanor Roosevelt and the concept of her concept of spirituality as an act of love. And I kept on thinking about Anna Deavere Smith play Let Me Down Easy, to which she just referred, and it's about the concept of grace. And so I was wondering if Anna and all the panelists could talk a little bit about the intersections with spirituality in their work.
Somebody else go first.
I just want to say I'm giving the panel a moment because it's such a big question that the Humanities Center is all about partnerships. We're having a partnership with the library tomorrow, which will be a Meet the Author talk at noon. Lisa Sanders will be speaking again, and you can get signed copies of her books. Did I give you guys enough time? But that really is an event, right? That really is noon at the library tomorrow. The other library, not this one. Don't come back.
Well, I will say that I came to language through Shakespeare, and what I thought was magical in terms of the repetition of sounds and rhythms to create characters. But in trying to make sense of that, it took me back in particular to a woman in my church, where I grew up in Baltimore, a black Methodist church, not AME for some reason, but just ME church. Not anywhere near as much fun as the AME church or the Baptist churches across town. People were pretty uptight and middle class, but there was Miss Green, who would start yelling about Jesus and just repeating over and over again
yes, Jesus, yes, Jesus. And it was like a storm. I mean, was amazing to me that it took over the church. It was that everybody had to stop. The preacher stopped. There was not. She was it. She was the vehicle for Jesus. And I would ask my mother about that, and she'd say, well, that's, you shouldn't, that's, Miss Green loves Jesus, and you shouldn't laugh about it. And I said, well, you love Jesus, and you don't do that. And I said, and Grandma loves Jesus, and she doesn't do that. And she said, well, if you sit next to Grandma in church, you'll see she's crying, and that's Jesus coming to Grandma. So there was something to me that was unresolved about the power of words, particularly repeated words. And so I would say that I think of words as, if not spiritual vehicles, at least the vehicle for magic and transformation. And of course, that's what an actor does, is to inhabit, an actor for the stage, is trying to find another presence inside of him or herself, inside of words. And certainly we experience this when people sing. So I think that there's some kind of a spiritual possibility that words have. That's where my relationship to spirituality in my work begins, I think, or an Indian poem that I came upon when I was trying to understand these things. The word, I walk here. And I wish I lived in a society where I believed in being able to speak words that would cause the rain or cause healing. And I appreciate that people do experience that.
Well, I would say that the main point of painting or composing music, whatever it is that you do, what you're hoping for, in spite of all those hard moments, those hard-working moments, those moments of doubt, is there comes a point when you lose yourself in the work. And I know there's a book about flow. I know it's what you're talking about, living in the moment. When your ego goes out the window, you are just part of the universe making, you don't even know what you're making, but that you have lost the ego. And to me, that's very spiritual.
Just two more words about this. Eleanor Roosevelt really was, all of her essays and editorials, many of them, not all of them, are steeped in a kind of spiritualism, which is why I called it a direction of the heart. And she was, but she was also devout in surprising ways. But her church, she was a high Episcopal church goer, and she would tell the children they should take communion. And when they objected, she would say things like, well, if you don't take communion, you're breaking step with the community. You're not being part of the community. And so, but the community for her was the planet. And so she was very close in the civil rights movement, which is so steeped, from the Southern Conference on Human Welfare in 1938 on. It's so steeped in interfaith reality. So there's Abraham Joshua Heschel and, the folks who really supported the civil rights movement, and then the alliances that get built during and after the war. But for Eleanor Roosevelt, hatred is just a sin. Hatred and bigotry and enforced poverty, these are sins.
Yes.
I'm Bill Ron. I live in Boston. I'm struck by, we have a president, of course, right now of the United States who's written to history, stories about his life. And you think back, that hasn't happened very often in our political culture. And I was thinking, of course, Nixon wrote a book called Six Crises, which was, slightly personal. And Kennedy wrote the Profiles of Courage, but Is there anything about the fact that we have a president today who's talking about stories, does that represent a change in the listeners?
What do you think, Blanche, about that?
It is an interesting.
Does it represent a change in the culture? You mean the political
No, I'm
climate?
thinking of the listeners. Does it represent that the American public?
The idea that we get the president we deserve.
Well, or the president that can relate to us at this much deeper level with his own stories, which is a very rare thing in politics.
Well, what's really rare about his stories is the universality of them.
That's
I mean, I've fallen in love with Wendell Willkie, who in 1942, FDR sends him around the world. And he has an epiphany as he goes around the world for FDR. There is no place on earth by plane farther than the East Coast to the West Coast by train. We are all in this together. Everything that happens anywhere affects everybody everywhere, one world. And Wendell Willkie then becomes a great, hero. Of course, he dies in 1944. FDR wants him as a running mate in 1944, but he dies. Nobody's ever really written a good biography of Willkie. He dies of too much. He drinks too much, he eats too much, he loves too much, and he has too much on his plate, and he drops dead of many heart attacks. Bottom line, since when you think about Kennedy, he wrote that as a student.
Yes.
At Harvard. It's a very young book. But these books are not young books, and they are universalist. They're globalist books. And they embrace, one could say they embrace the future, and I think that's where we are. And I love what you said about the drumming. He's instructing us to march because we must march again, my darling. I mean, we need movements to, to counter the teabaggers and the folks who are moving him in other directions that we don't want to go.
I think we have time for one more question in this format, and then we're not going to rush you out the door. We can talk casually for 20 minutes or so, circulate, mingle a little bit. You actually get a chance to meet the panelists. This is not the usual venue, but we do have time for one more question or comment. If someone has one, I don't want to ignore. Yes, also the library.
Library. But I don't work in the library.
That's okay. Just introduce yourself and be very loud.
Corinne Bertucci. I'm an alumna of Northeastern. We've been talking about the storytellers. And I wonder, and this is a question to you, what impact has the storytellers had on the listeners? I think back, and I've been through the women's movement, and I've gone through the civil rights movement, and it's very frustrating that very little has happened. And that is my judgment. So, what impact has the storyteller had on all of us?
Probably just the right closing question. Sorry, but you're to my left.
I mean, there's so many stories now. And there's so many venues for stories now. I think the question, not to rephrase your question, has more to do with something I said earlier, which is, or I didn't really say it, but I wonder if there is a need for a convenient place. I don't know if that's like an old-fashioned idea. If anything, I worry, even in a university and online, all the places that we hear stories, we can choose the kind of story we want to hear. And so how do we, and is it important to make not so much a universal story, but to find a way of encouraging people to experience the unfamiliar and to find new ways of negotiating with the unfamiliar.
You know, it seems to me that many people don't like the unfamiliar. They don't like uncertainty. And I think it's asking too much of them to ask them to embrace it. I mean, I think we just have to accept people for who they are. I think that there's people who seek out what's different, seek out what's interesting, and those people will always be special.
But can't a university, I mean, we're in the home of the president of a university, can't a university do something to at least extend that tolerance?
You know, I don't even think it's a tolerance. I think it's who people are. I mean, I think that there are people who are fundamentally clingers, and then there are people who are swimmers. You know, and if you're a person who clings to the dock, to pull you away seems like an act of cruelty and too much to ask them to embrace swimming. But I think that we have to be appreciative of the people who are willing to run out there, swim out there, go out and find something that's new and different, and hope that they can come back and talk to the people who are still clinging to the dock.
You know, when I was at James Bossier Elementary School in Baltimore, Maryland, where everybody was a colored child, and the difference was mainly about the colors within that race. There's no way I wanted to go to Garrison Junior High School and to go to school with predominantly Jewish children who didn't want me there. But they pulled me away from that dock, and they made me go. And the people who didn't want me there had to go to school with me. And it may have been the fact that we were all clingers, but some of us turned into swimmers.
I really like that. I want to just add a medical metaphor to that, because that's really important. I mean, we've seen all these folks who say, well, certainly we don't want medical care for immigrants. And certainly we don't want medical care for poor people. And, you know, all those folks who waste their time and our money, we don't want to cover them. And then you say, well, look, suppose somebody has TB and is on a train and coughs at you. Aren't we all safer when we're all safer? Isn't it better for everybody when it's better for everybody? And at some point, the clingers and the swimmers have gotten to understand it's better for everybody when it's better for everybody. And we're all in this together.